Even further full disclosure, the credit actually goes to two of our students who were alumni of a course that Professor Michael Nacht and I teach, Nuclear Security, the Nexus Between Policy and Technology, Spiros Tanu and Carla McKinley, who had proposed this. And of course, as you know, there have been many discussions on campus and panels over the past couple of weeks of this crisis from different aspects, regional and otherwise. But I think they argued, I think very persuasively, that something that was looming very large was the nuclear angle here that we need to engage. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has pushed Europe and the world to the brink of nuclear conflict. Vladimir Putin has already crossed lines. He has invaded a democratic and sovereign country. He slaughtered Ukrainian citizens, targeted Ukrainian's president for murder, deployed cluster bombs and thermobaric weapons. He's indicated his willingness to violate the nuclear taboo and has escalated readiness of Russian nuclear forces. He has attacked and seized civilian nuclear facilities with grave radiological risk. The world, as a result, faces the most serious nuclear crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis and perhaps since the advent of the nuclear era. How likely is Vladimir Putin to use nuclear weapons? If he does, how might he use them? How fast could a nuclear crisis escalate? And would the United States be able to avoid embroilment? Would American cities be targeted? Even if Putin does not use nuclear weapons, what might be the consequences of invasion of Ukraine for the non-proliferation regime and for nuclear security more generally? Before we begin, let me acknowledge and thank the Institute for International Studies and the Goldman School of Public Policy for sponsoring this event, and Linda Meyerson and Claudia Gay for their work in helping organizing. Thank you so much, because this has been a heavy lift to do on a very short time scale. My job is easy. There are many questions and few answers. I get to ask the questions. My four panelists who I'm about to introduce have the difficult job of answering them. And you also will have your opportunity to pose some questions. I'm going to introduce the speakers and then tell you about the flow of the event today. Dr. George Breslauer is former Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost of UC Berkeley. He is currently a professor of the Graduate School in the Department of Political Science. Dr. Breslauer specializes in Soviet and Russian politics and foreign relations and has authored and edited 12 books on the topic. I should say that all our panelists are very distinguished. Their lengthy bios appeared in the electronic announcement here, so I'm going to give slightly abbreviated ones in order for us to get on with the discussion. Dr. Bethany Goldblum, here with us virtually, is a staff scientist in the Nuclear Science Division at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and an associate research engineer in the Department of Nuclear Engineering and the executive director of the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium, a major center of excellence funded by the National Nuclear Security Administration, Department of Nonproliferation. She is the founder and director of the Nuclear Policy Working Group. Thank you, Bethany, for joining us. Dr. Michael Nacht is the former dean in Goldman School of Public Policy and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, a position for which he received the Distinguished Public Service Award, the department's highest civilian honor. He served both in the Clinton and the Obama administrations. He is a specialist in U.S. national security policy and science, technology, and public policy, and has written 6 books and more than 80 articles and chapters on these topics. Dr. Daniel Sargent is an associate professor in the Department of History and at the Goldman School of Public Policy, a specialist in American foreign relations in the Cold War era. Dr. Sargent also co-directs UC Berkeley Institute of International Studies and has authored, co-authored, and co-edited multiple books on foreign policy, including a forthcoming textbook situating the history of the United States in a global context. So the flow of events here, we've done the introductions. We have a series of questions that have been submitted in writing, just a few of them for the panelists to begin to engage. These are very substantive questions. About half of the time we'll be engaging these questions. We're going to then open it up for audience-sourced questions, both the people who are attending real time here live with us, and also for those of you who are attending by Zoom as well. and then we'll have some time for some closing remarks. So without further ado, let me come to the first of a series of questions. Last week, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned the Third World War would be nuclear and destructive. What do we know about the profile and capabilities of Russian nuclear forces? How should we compare Russian nuclear capabilities with those of the United States? What about Russian nuclear doctrine? How bold is the line that demarcates conventional and nuclear capabilities in Russian military doctrine? I'll direct these questions to one panelist at the outset, but all of our panelists will be able to add on to that as well. This first question I'd like to address to Michael. Professor Nacht.
Thank you, Karl. The Russian nuclear forces are arranged somewhat similarly to the US forces at the strategic nuclear level, at the intercontinental level. We each have about 5,000 warheads. The Russians have a few more than we do, based on intercontinental ballistic missiles on land, based on long-range bombers, and based on submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And I would jump ahead to say that the mutual deterrence relationship between Russia and the United States has held firm for many decades, based on the principal assumption that no matter which side struck first, the other side had a secure retaliatory capability that could destroy the attacking side. And therefore, a condition of mutual assured destruction was present. I still think that's the case. And therefore, I don't think, at least at this stage, there's much likelihood at all of a strategic nuclear exchange between the US and the Russian Federation. However, where there is a major asymmetry is at the so-called tactical or theater level. Here, the Russians have more than 2,000 weapons, some deployed to the western military districts of Russia, some deployed on the Sino-Russian border. And these are so-called low-yield weapons, although the yield is in the hundreds of kilotons, and many times the weapon yield from the Hiroshima bomb. What I think is extremely troublesome is that in recent years, the Russians adopted a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. And the argument there was that if the Russians attacked one of the Baltic states with conventional weapons, they would be able to deter a NATO conventional response, NATO conventional retaliation against Russian attack on NATO forces with a small number of nuclear weapons. Now, this is a theory, maybe it's a doctrine. It's quite interesting that the man attributed to the doctrine, General Gerasimov, allegedly was just killed by Ukrainian forces on Monday. It's an extraordinary development, if true. So I think what we're looking at here is the US and Russia fencing off to avoid conflict with each other, but it could lead to tactical use of nuclear weapons by the Russians, and that would put the United States in a tough position to respond. The US has about, as I said, the Russians have about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. The US has about 200 based in 5 military NATO bases in Western Europe. So what the United States would do if the Russians actually were the first users of nuclear weapons is hard to say, but it would be a catastrophic development for everyone concerned if they did. Why don't I start with that?
Any of our other panelists like to add on to that?
Yeah, Michael, can you tell us why any decision maker in Moscow would feel the need to use tactical battlefield nuclear weapons rather than the kind of rockets and artillery and air force that they have now?
I think the only real reason would be if they thought that NATO was going to engage with the Ukrainian conflict. But what's very disturbing is, you know, the profile about Putin, that Putin has been isolated for a long time, that he isn't surrounded by anyone who's going to put any brakes on what he's doing. And he clearly is jumped in with both feet into this Ukrainian crisis, right? I mean, he is the author, allegedly, of this major paper last summer denying the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign state. He has said this a number of times before. He invaded Crimea. He's controlling the Donbass in the east. So he is totally committed to this conflict. Now, the question is, what happens if the conflict doesn't go his way? It hasn't gone his way so far. The military forces have been bogged down, like the big supply chain that was headed to Kyiv. They've lost perhaps several thousand soldiers. He's tried to clamp down on any resistance in Russia to his policy. So this is it's almost a psychological question, a psychiatric question. At what point would he possibly feel so threatened that he would actually consider using nuclear weapons? I don't know the answer to that. But I think it's a very alarming set of conditions that we're confronting.
And in addition to the scenario facing, fear surrounding NATO, you could also imagine the use of nuclear weapons in the face of imminent battlefield defeat. So if the Russian offense stalls, Putin has a lot at stake here. So it's not infeasible that he could direct a single low-yield nuclear strike at Kiev with the aim of killing President Zelensky. And then, continue to make demands of the successor of demilitarization and neutral status of Ukraine, which, because the US has made it clear will not intervene in the conflict, Ukraine may be in more of a position to capitulate. And so while, this Russia would certainly be an international outcast, but he would have avoided humiliation in the conflict, and it's not inconceivable.
I wonder if I could sort of respond to, sort of build off of, Bethany's sort of terrific intervention. And I did want to acknowledge, sort of as I pose my question, the passing of our late colleague in political science, Bob Powell. Bob's erudition and his immense, insight into sort of dynamics of intense sort of geopolitical conflict under circumstance of severe stress, such as those that the world is experiencing today. I mean, Bob is sorely missed, but his wisdom and insight are today missed with, I think, particular acuteness. I think one theme or conclusion that I've taken from Bob's research, Bob's work, is the importance of commitment in high stakes standoffs like that in which the Russian Federation is now involved. And I wonder, what the risks are that Putin actually leverages the nuclear taboo as a source of opportunity, right? Putin has crossed many lines, but there's one line that he hasn't crossed, which is the use of a nuclear weapon. Nobody has used a nuclear weapon in anger since 1945. We all know that. And I wonder whether the taboo could actually be a strategic opportunity in some sense for Putin. What stronger and more dramatic display, could we contemplate of Putin's commitment than the use of a nuclear weapon? And I'm curious, I think, as to what the other panelists think, and also if that seems like a scenario of which we should be fearful, what are the forms in which nuclear use might occur? Bethany suggested that, Putin could target Ukrainian cities, which seems like an obvious risk. But maybe there's also a risk of Putin, detonating a nuclear device over the Black Sea or over the Baltic Sea, and then issuing an ultimatum and saying 24 hours later, if Kyiv doesn't surrender, Kyiv will be next. Are these risks that we should be concerned about, given sort of the opportunity that is inherent in the nuclear taboo for Putin to stage a very spectacular demonstration of his commitment?
Well, I would say that anything's possible. It depends in part on what stake you see Putin having in absolute victory. I think he's an angry man. He's been angry since 2007. I think he's gotten angrier over time. And I think in the last year, he's become apoplectic. So you do have to worry about what risks he would be willing to run. On his invocation of nuclear weapons when he first started the invasion, we got to put that in perspective. I think it was a signal of resolve more than an actual belief on his part that this could go nuclear and he'd be willing to do it. Back in 1973, when the Israeli army had the Egyptian Third Army trapped in the Sinai Desert, Kissinger saw an opportunity there to strike a deal if he could enforce a stalemate. And so he signaled the Israelis, don't you dare assault the Egyptian Third Army. And he signaled Brezhnev, who was talking then about, or signaling then about sending troops to prevent the Israelis from decimating the Egyptians. He signaled Brezhnev that the United States would not countenance the Soviet Union sending troops. And what he did in order to reinforce that was he raised the nuclear alert level to its highest level, DEFCON 3. And that's what I thought of when Putin said what he said. It was a way of signaling the depth of his resolve rather than an intention actually to use nuclear weapons.
Great. This has, I think, been quite a rich, ponderable question. Let's move on to another facet of this discussion. Many of us, including three of us on the panel, remember two very chilling weeks in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The question I have is whether that is a useful point of reference to understand the current situation. I think every executive, the head of a sovereign state in a crisis like this always grasps for a crutch, or sort of grasp for models or some kind of structure with which to understand the current crisis. Is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 a good point of reference, or maybe a misleading point of reference to understand the current situation? Are there lessons in crisis management that may be applicable to the Ukraine war? And are the risks of nuclear conflagration greater or lesser than the current situation than in 1962? And let me ask Dr. Breslauer to start us off here.
Sure. I think it's useful, even though I think that the nuclear danger may be greater today than it was then. And here's what I have in mind. There, in the literature on nuclear deterrence, there are these two theories, one associated with Kenneth Waltz, another associated with Scott Sagan of Stanford. Kenneth Waltz was of Berkeley when he wrote his theories. And basically, Waltz's argument was that nuclear deterrence is the best, or nuclearism is the best deterrent to World War III, that it is the smelling salts of international relations, that when you're in a situation in which a nuclear exchange is a possibility because of the level of hostility, that's when policymakers suddenly get sobered up because of the reality of nuclear weapons. Scott Sagan at Stanford, by contrast, argues that intentional nuclear war is not the great danger. The great danger is inadvertent or accidental nuclear exchanges as a result of mechanical failures, as a result of misperceptions, as a result of accidents. Now, when I think back on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I see Kennedy and Khrushchev, once they were both focused on this issue of the United States pushing back against the Soviets sending nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba, they both got sobered up. Kennedy rejected the advice of his most hardline advisors, and Khrushchev was willing to back off once he saw Kennedy impose a quarantine. That seems to validate or at least help support Kenneth Waltz's theory of nuclear weapons being the smelling salts of international relations. However, there's one complication there, and that is Fidel Castro at the time, as a result of the as a result of the access to archives that have led to a rich literature about this crisis, Fidel Castro had a Masada complex. His attitude, he was angry that the Soviets were not willing to actually hit at the United States rather than withdraw those missiles from Cuba. And he seems to have exhibited a willingness to go down fighting, even in a nuclear exchange. So that's a bit complicating, if not sobering. Now, there's another aspect to that crisis, and that is there was a diplomatic back channel to Moscow, as well as a collective leadership in Moscow, in which Mikoyan was an actor who was very close to Khrushchev and was always urging him to be more accommodating. But that back channel was well developed and well used. Now, how does that differ from today? Today's crisis is one in which we don't have a back channel that I know of to the Kremlin. It's not a collective leadership, so whatever back channel got established would have to go directly to Putin. You couldn't count on others in the leadership urging caution on him because it's a one-man show over there. Another thing is that there's much more fog of war in this crisis than there was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there was not an active war going on. And in the fog of war, the chance of an accidental nuclear launch is greater than it was at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a third dimension to this, and that is that there are multiple aspects of this crisis that could go nuclear, whereas there was only really one aspect that could go nuclear back in October 62. Here you've got the prospect that Michael has already told us is not, and I agree entirely, is not a high prospect, and that's a strategic nuclear exchange. But then you've also got the battlefield nuclear weapon option because you're in an ongoing war. And you've got the nuclear power plants in Ukraine that could get caught up in this, especially if the Russians are using dumb bombs really rather than precision weaponry and happen to hit another one of those nuclear power plants, but not a side building, but rather the plant itself. Then you've got nuclear radiation problems, which we may already be having conceivably in Chernobyl, that would add a nuclear dimension to this that would not be necessarily intended, but would be part of that accident in the fog of war. So I see this as having dimensions that have higher prospect for accidental nuclear detonation than was the case in October 62, though I can't give a probability estimate of that. Who knows? As far as intention, I see Putin as not a psychopath, I don't view him as out of his mind, but I do view him as very angry. And I was sobered up yesterday when the American intelligence community reported to Congress its finding that Putin feels he cannot afford to lose this war. That is, if accurate, and everybody's got their own ideas as to what Putin is actually thinking. If it's accurate, that suggests that a diplomatic compromise before things go too much farther is really an imperative.
I could add a little bit to what George said. Carl, may I do that?
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. So I think a core distinction between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the current war in Ukraine is what's often called the asymmetry of stakes. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously, it's in America's backyard. We had a big naval advantage over the Soviet fleet. I don't think any American president could have tolerated missiles in Cuba under, at that time, a fairly fanatical communist leader, Fidel Castro, that could target territory everywhere from Florida up to Washington, D.C. So this was really our neighborhood. They came into our neighborhood. And I think we were willing to go fairly far, although, as George said, ultimately Kennedy compromised. He actually made some secret agreement to withdraw missiles from Turkey and so forth. But definitely, it was much more of a major, almost emotional issue for the United States than it was for the Soviet Union. Today, it's just the reverse. You have Ukraine, which Putin has, commented on quite a number of times, and he used military force quite a number of times. He just does not. I'm convinced, he's convinced that Ukraine is not a sovereign state, that it's really part of Russia, and he's going to grab it, even if it risks a major war in Europe, even if it risks even a nuclear war. And he, at the moment, as George says, is the only leader that counts. That makes it a very, very dangerous situation because I think the Ukrainian ability to inflict casualties on the Russian army and to almost embarrass the Russian army with their lack of military prowess only drives Putin more into a corner than before. And therefore, I think it's much more dangerous now than it was even then.
Let me ask a question here, both of all the panels, but particularly George and Michael. The point is well taken about the fact that we are dealing with a leader who is absolutely autocratic and calling the shots on his. There is a potential actor here. The one person who could possibly exert persuasion on Putin might be Xi Jinping. China every day, I think, is in a increasingly problematic political situation. I mean, this is a very awkward situation for them. And as time goes on, I think it's becoming more and more awkward. China's walking a very fine line. If Putin were to do something, I think, so unwise as to use even a tactical nuclear weapon, even as a display, it might become unsupportable politically for China to be his safety net anymore. And I think Russia may know that. So the question is, although we don't have a well-honed back channel in the normal diplomatic sense, we may have, ironically, China as a way, maybe the only way to ultimately broker some kind of reasonable off-ramp for Putin. Maybe that is completely unrealistic, but I'd like to hear.
Well, it certainly must have been sobering for Putin to see that China did not vote with Russia in the United Nations General Assembly on the condemnation of the invasion. They abstained, they didn't vote against. They were one of the 35 abstentions. But that could, at the same time, in their public presentations, they spoke about being a strategic partner and Russia being their most important strategic partner, which would sort of run counter. But nonetheless, I think we should be exploring the extent to which China does not want this war in Ukraine to escalate.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that, in fact, the pretty tough sanctions that Biden has approved and implemented against Russia is a warning signal to the Chinese. The Chinese obviously are fully interconnected into the global economy, which Russia is not. And I don't think China wants to even contemplate the notion that their siding with Russia could lead to some kind of comparable set of US sanctions and Western sanctions against China. Now, it would hurt everybody. It might plunge the whole world into a global depression. But China is much more vulnerable to the sanctions in a way than Russia is. Also, I was observing that the Germans had said that because Russia was so dependent on providing oil and natural gas to Europe, as well as Europe being dependent upon natural gas and oil from Russia, that the Russians would behave themselves. They would never try anything like this because it would be risking this huge market. And yet Putin went ahead and did it. So, it's really a conundrum of how we're going to get out of this mess.
Thank you. Let's move on. I do want to make sure we get through a few questions and then open it up for the audience to be able to ask questions as well. Let's make a little change in tack right now and talk about the attack last week, the Russian attack last week on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, and which made international news. This was a nuclear power station a week ago that nobody could pronounce, and only some of us can now pronounce. We also have, of course, the occupation of the Chernobyl defunct nuclear power plant, where there was a core team of staff of 200 workers, which should be rotating off twice daily, but are in fact having to stay in place with no rations and little sleep to maintain the facility. We have this inexplicable event of the Russians blowing up in Kharkiv the sort of a nuclear research facility that did not really pose a nuclear radiological hazard, but just seemed to be absolutely unwarranted. So I'd like to ask Bethany, first of all, give us a little bit of ground truth particularly about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power incident and its implications for continued underlying role of nuclear power in the Ukrainian crisis. What are the Russians really after here with some of these bizarre actions?
Thank you, Karl. And also thank you to IIS for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. So I'll say it's no doubt a serious issue. The IAEA Director General Grossi has repeatedly called on military forces to refrain from violence near the plant. Though I have seen some reports that Zaporizhzhia is similar to or even 10 times worse than Chernobyl, or that it could be. And that's just not the case. There were a number of issues that contributed to produce the effects that we're seeing at Chernobyl. And there are some key differences in the designs between Chernobyl and the Zaporizhzhia plant. So Chernobyl was a light water graphite reactor with a special design and a positive void coefficient. So reactors cooled by boiling water, they have a certain amount of steam in the core. And as there's a change in the proportion of steam bubbles or voids in the core, then that can lead to a change in reactivity. And so if there's a negative void coefficient as the amount of steam bubbles increase, then the reactivity goes down. But for the case of Chernobyl, the void coefficient was positive. So when the power began to increase, then more steam was produced, which then increased the power and then increased the steam production and so on and so on. And there were a number of other issues as well. For example, the design of the control rods led to a positive scram effect, where the initial entry of the control rods into the core initially increased the reactivity, which also contributed to increased power. And Zaporizhzhia is a pressurized water reactor. They have the site has pressurized water reactors with a negative void coefficient. So the types of things that we saw with Chernobyl just can't happen here. And it also has a robust containment structure, which wasn't true for Chernobyl. And that provides significant protection in the case of fire or even stray missiles. And both the IAEA and the DOE have indicated that there are no elevated radiation readings in the region. But there are still some real concerns. So it was recently communicated that 5 of the 6 reactors on the site were being shut down safely. But even after the reactors are shut down, cooling to the core needs to be maintained to accommodate the decay heat from the fission products. And so this active cooling requires that you have power to pump the water to the core, keep it circulating so that the core doesn't melt down. And there are also backup systems in place, but when there's military action there as well, that could cause damage to the backup systems, and this is a vulnerability. And then there are also spent fuel ponds on the site, and they require cooling as well. And so if there were damage to the spent fuel pools where the water was leaking or boiling off, then the fuel rods could be exposed and overheat and also potentially start a fire. So, and another real concern, which you mentioned, is that Ukraine recently informed the IAEA that Zaporizhzhia is now under the command of Russian forces. And so the regular staff are there continuing to operate the plant, but there are concerns about whether or not they can rotate safely, continued safe operation, and whether or not they feel like they can make decisions free of undue pressure. So this remains an area of concern.
Could I just add an observation? I was struck by the asymmetry in statements made by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Jill Ruby, the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration. The U.S. ambassador to the UN said at the Security Council that we dodged a bullet. This was on the verge of a major nuclear meltdown, and we were just lucky they didn't hit all the stuff and preclude the water getting to the plant. Where Jill Ruby said it was never a question of that being a major risk, and the likelihood of a core meltdown was negligible.
Thank you. Let's do 2 more questions from the previous questions submitted and then open it up here. And let me direct this question to Daniel. Despite calls from Ukrainian President Zelensky and others for the imposition of a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, why is NATO reluctant to concede? As U.S. Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, has claimed, backed by several other members of Congress, would a no-fly zone truly indicate the starting of World War III?
Great. Wow.
That's an easy one.
Yeah, so what should U.S. policy be? Well, I think we can probably all agree that the implementation of a no-fly zone would be less risky than former President Trump's suggestion that NATO put Chinese insignia on F-22s and send them into Ukraine. That's not a serious proposal. I think that the no-fly zone is a more serious proposal, and it should be taken seriously. But I think the question of how risky it is, how reckless it might be, depending upon your point of view, depends ultimately on what you think of Vladimir Putin's ultimate objectives, really are. If you believe that Ukraine is the sum total of Putin's, military objectives, then I think, it may be hard to mobilize the argument, the case for a no-fly zone. Right, sending F-22s, F-35s into combat over the skies of Ukraine, putting U.S. warplanes and Russian warplanes in head-to-head combat, which did not happen during the entirety of the Cold War. U.S. and Chinese warplanes did engage in direct conflict over the Korean Peninsula, but U.S. and Soviet warplanes never did. So this would be a new threshold of escalation in the military sort of rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union / Russia. And that's not an escalatory step that Washington should take lightly. But if you believe that Vladimir Putin would not be satisfied even by the successful prosecution of the war in Ukraine, if you believe that Vladimir Putin, once he's subjugated Ukraine, will next turn his attention to a country that is protected as a member of NATO by an Article 5 guarantee, then there may actually be a case to make for a no-fly zone as the less risky choice. Because if Putin chooses 6 months hence, having subjugated Ukraine, to send his forces into Lithuania, the United States is going to be faced with an even starker dilemma. Will the United States honor its Article 5 guarantee and put US combat forces into operation against Russia's army? Or will the United States abscond from its Article 5 guarantee and in effect acknowledge the disintegration of the Atlantic Alliance and of NATO? That's a high stakes problem for the United States. And when you sort of reckon with the possibility that this is a choice that President Biden may have to make before the expiration of his first term as president, then I think the stakes of this debate over a no-fly zone in Ukraine start to look a little different. And you can actually begin to make the case, as Senator Rubio has done, for a no-fly zone as a move that would not be wildly escalatory, that could actually be NATO's best opportunity to stop Putin before he is able to complete the subjugation of Ukraine.
Rather bullish statement. Let me open this up to the other panelists here.
I would hope we take it one step at a time rather than letting current policy be dictated by what might happen later. Currently, I think a no-fly zone, those who are in Washington, D.C. advocating the no-fly zone are arguing that it should be a limited no-fly zone for purposes of protecting civilians that are fleeing the Ukrainian cities. That sounds noble, although it also sounds highly risky, and not only because of Putin's likely reaction to it, but also because, as we found in Libya in 2011, mission creep often happens when you go into that kind of a scenario, and it's hard to imagine that we would limit that no-fly zone to simply protection of civilians when we're getting to the border of that no-fly zone and there are Russian airplanes confronting us. I think it's a very risky thing to do, and I'm happy to see that today the resistance to it, both in Western Europe and in the United States, is very strong.
Although it's interesting that Michael McFaul of Stanford, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, supports it, arguing that if we're going to send in Stinger and other kinds of missiles into Ukraine, we could also send aircraft without American pilots. He makes that point. But I think you're right. As of now, it doesn't look like President Biden wants to do it, and he doesn't have the support to do it. I would like to also mention something we haven't talked about, which is quite unknowable in the unclassified world, and that is the precise status of cyber capability to dismantle and to make inoperative both Russian or American nuclear systems. We both know we have very substantial cyber capabilities, most of which is very highly classified. And this is maybe a more alarmist view, but I don't think it is out of the question that if Russia were to use even one tactical nuclear weapon on a NATO country, that the US would consider, if it could, an all-out effort to disarm all of Russia's nuclear forces. This is really rolling the dice, but I think they feel that they're up against a Hitlerian threat that has to be defeated at all costs.
Let me pose a question to the other panelists here. If you take the long view of this, and of course we certainly do not want to see a sovereign nation fall like this to this kind of heinous and inexplicable behavior. But I see, in a sense, this is a bit like, as we're used to now, an inoculation. One sees the attitudes of the NATO countries dramatically shifting in a matter of the past 2 weeks. A resolve to, to sort of belly up to their commitments to NATO, to increase the fraction of GDP to the military, a very admirable working together that maybe a lot of people did not predict that we would. Putin has, I think it has been very, very poor showing against an inferior military, which is now, an army which is exhausted and depleted. It will take years, not a matter of months, before he would be able to rebuild. And I think he would now have second thoughts about engaging in a superior combined NATO force. So I have a sense that this may be a kind of an inoculation that would give him serious pause before we would ever make an attempt against a NATO company, a NATO country. That's a personal opinion, and I would invite comment on that.
I hope you're right.
I personally don't think that Putin is suffocating Ukrainian sovereignty and seeking to occupy the country as a first step toward taking on Eastern Europe. I think that's a misreading of the reason he's in Ukraine now. He's in Ukraine now not because of a nostalgia for as Michael said earlier, regathering the Slavic lands and the Russian world. He's in Ukraine now because for the last 14 years and more, he's been complaining about NATO's seeking to prepare Ukraine for eventual, down the line, NATO membership. And then in the last year or more, the supply of conventional defensive weaponry to Ukraine has accelerated enormously. And he threw down the gauntlet last fall, and he said, I want to guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO, and I want you to back off with your most forward positioned troops in Eastern Europe. I think the latter was probably a throwaway demand, but the first was the main one. And he's been saying that Ukraine must never join NATO for 14 years, and we have not been willing even to discuss it. We could have, I believe, 5 years ago, even more recently, reached a deal with Putin to neutralize Ukraine on the model of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. And I think he would have jumped at that. But because we kept saying, take the diplomatic path, but on that path, we won't discuss your key demands. They're off the table. I think he just got increasingly angry. And I think that's why he's invaded and is basically doing to Ukraine what he did to the capital of Chechnya back in 2000, level it.
Right.
I'm not, I blame us for having pushed him into a corner. I blame him for the criminal way in which he is fighting his way out of that corner. But I think that to overstate his ambitions simply in order to support one or the other policy is irresponsible.
But I would say that Putin's views about Ukraine being a neutral state are not just based on geopolitical issues, they're based on domestic issues. I think he feels very deeply that a Ukraine with a democratic, capitalist, Western-leaning society would pose ultimately a threat to his own rule in Russia, which he hopes will continue for an eternity. So there's a reason why we didn't want to do that, besides what has been stated.
Well, I would argue, as I argued before, and I think it's worth a try, because if there's going to be a diplomatic settlement to this that heads off the flattening of Ukraine or an East-West confrontation that could escalate into the East European theater, if, for example, we're sending convoys of weaponry into Ukraine from Eastern European places, you could see, if Putin sees this as a military disadvantage for him, you could see him bombing those supply convoys and perhaps even their supply depots on the other side of the Ukrainian border. So this has high escalatory potential. And I don't think we are served well by assuming the worst and preparing for the worst rather than seeking the diplomatic offering.
Thank you. Actually, just a comment here from Stephen Harris, who I think builds on this point. He says, step one in setting up a no-fly zone is suppressing anti-aircraft missiles, including the S-400 systems. These systems operate from Russian territory, so setting up a no-fly zone requires attacking Russian proper, of course. So, okay, let's finish the prepared questions, the submitted questions, with one last one, and then open it up here. When we do open up, and I will ask, so you can start asking your questions now, for the Zoom audience, submit your questions by the chat box, where there's lots and lots of things coming in, and I'll try to order them and combine them. Of course, the audience here with us in Moses Hall, we'll just take them as the hands come up. Final question, sort of preliminarily submitted. What precedent does this crisis set for the future of nuclear conflict? Even if the war in Ukraine ends without Russia employing its nuclear capability, what are the implications for global nuclear insecurity? After all, Ukraine, under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, agreed to give up Soviet-era nuclear arms in return for Russian security guarantee. Had Ukraine retained a nuclear capability, Putin might not have invaded. Does Ukraine's experience spell the likely end of the global non-proliferation regime? Wow. And that one, Professor Nacht, over to you.
Well, I mean, look, Russia violated totally the Budapest Agreement, right? They guaranteed the respect of Ukrainian sovereignty in return for Ukraine relinquishing its weapons to Russia and getting energy assistance on the side. So yes, I think that this is an alarming development in the nuclear proliferation sense, because it shows countries that they may be very careful relinquishing nuclear weapons, because their own sovereignty could be at risk. And for those countries that don't have nuclear weapons, they may feel that it's better to acquire them in order to maintain their sovereignty. So I think this is a potentially, even if the war ends without nuclear weapon use, and I pray it does, it could be actually, in retrospect, a proliferatory development, because it would strengthen the hands of those in countries who say, we have to have nuclear weapons if we're going to maintain our sovereignty. And that could be in South Korea, that could be in Japan, it could be in Taiwan, and elsewhere. It could be in the Middle East, it could be in Saudi Arabia, it could be in Egypt.
I think it's also important to realize that the situation with Ukraine is really unique as well, though. I mean, they never actually possessed their own nuclear arsenal. So they inherited these weapons following the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it would have taken significant cost to be able to maintain the capability. And there was also a ton of political pressure and threat of sanctions as well, encouraging them to give up these weapons. And initially, they rushed to return many of the weapons, the tactical nuclear forces, even prior to the Budapest Memorandum, I think because they saw the vulnerability of managing these weapons, which were ending their lifespan and also needed to be modernized. And so it would be a significant cost to Ukraine. It would have been a significant cost for them to maintain this. Also, they wanted to, more than 50% of their power comes from nuclear. And so they want to be able to engage in nuclear cooperation agreements. And so there would have been pushback on those relationships as well. And so there were a lot of factors going into Ukraine's decision to give up the weapons at that time. And so I don't think that should necessarily serve as a kind of precedent or template for other countries when considering a nuclear weapon status.
Wonderful. Let's now switch, and we've had some hands here. Mansuk Lee.
Yes, a simple question. Should we lift sanctions after war ends on Russia's term?
Carl, can you repeat the question, please?
I'm going to repeat the question here, but I want to make sure I understand the question. If the war ends favorably, in other words, there's a new government set up there, should we lift the sanctions? I think that was heard and understood by everybody.
That's right.
Okay. Well, okay. Who's up?
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. If the war ends favorably, in what sense?
To the Russians.
The question is, if Russia wins, should
I
the
see.
United States lift the economic sanctions? I think, it's a very difficult question. Ends on what terms? In the aftermath of what variety and what intensity of war crimes. So, it's a speculative question, but it is, I think, a opportunity for us to reflect upon, the significant costs that the massive economic and particularly financial sanctions regime that the United States has enacted, are imposing on Russia today. I think we, in the United States, intuit to think about sanctions, the instruments of economic warfare, as something like wholly different from instruments of kinetic warfare. And I would urge that we maybe, be wary of overdrawing that distinction, right? The longer this sanctions regime persists, the longer, Russian reserve assets remain locked up at the behest of the Fed, the more dire the economic situation within Russia is going to become, the more deleterious the political consequences for Vladimir Putin will become. Putin has already characterized the sanctions regime as an act of war, right? And I think we have to, be mindful of the reality that actions that the United States and its partners are already taking look from a Russian standpoint to be really quite belligerent. So I'm not answering your question, but what I would urge you to do is to conceive of sanctions as situating on a spectrum of options, not as a binary alternative to kinetic confrontation.
Very good. Thank you.
Hi. Couple questions. Firstly, President Biden gets a lot of credit for trying to thread the needle between punishing Russia without escalating into a more dangerous exchange. But if we look backwards, I wonder whether Biden's statesmanship has really been an abysmal failure in the sense that could he not have drawn a line in the sand in November and said, if the sovereign territory of Ukraine is violated, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, we will treat this as we're going to make a full commitment to it. Then wouldn't that have forestalled an invasion, or would it have?
So let me try to repeat the question. Although Biden is getting high marks in the press for statesmanship and threading the needle, had he drawn the line in the sand past November and said, even though Ukraine is not a NATO country, that we would not abide such a invasion, would not that have deterred the invasion? I'll let others go first, but I have my own opinion on that. But George, had we made such a declaratory statement back months ago in the fall, would that have deterred this conflict?
I doubt it, quite frankly, because Putin's frame of mind was the West is trying to draw Ukraine into NATO. NATO is an anti-Russian alliance. And therefore, if they are going to declare now that even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, we're going to defend it, I think he would have probably said, okay, we'll see, and gone in anyway. That's my guess.
I don't think it's
a broader war with NATO.
I don't think it's a realistic question, because there was never any chance that Biden would make a commitment on the security of Ukraine in order to deter a Russian attack, because of the fact that that was where the line was drawn. Ukraine was not a NATO member, and the US security policy is based on one for all and all for one of the 30 NATO members, and not every other country. So I don't think that was ever in the cards. And I think instead they hoped that by diplomacy and the threat of economic sanctions, they could deter him, and that proved to be incorrect.
A follow-up to this question, we also don't actually have full insight into what sort of deals or attempts at deals were being struck up diplomatically before those talks kind of abruptly ended the morning of the invasion. But do we think perhaps, like, I don't know if you guys have more speculation on this, that as far as I know, the nuclear posture review for the Biden administration was supposed to be released in February, and I have heard nothing on the progress for that since the invasion started. Is there a chance that perhaps there was some stronger language that you might all be privy to, or things that you've heard that was going to be included either isn't, or maybe we're refraining from releasing that report because of the fact that there is an ongoing conflict that has had repeated incidences of nuclear escalation threats?
Thank you. Actually, let me identify Spiro Tanu and Carla McKinley, who in fact were the two students I alluded to at the outset who proposed this panel. So thank you both. What Carla has asked about was something I think many of us have been thinking about, and I think wanted to ask, which is, the NPR was supposed to be out by now. We were all hypothesizing whether they would stay the course with some adoption of tactical nuclear weapons or backtrack on the vector of the previous administration. And one could ask the question more bluntly: is the lessons from this particular conflict likely to have an influence on what really turns up in the NPR? With that, there's no better person to ask than Michael. So, Michael, is this going to are the lessons of this conflict right now going to find their way into U.S. policy?
I believe so, because I think it highlights the potential importance of the Russian advantage in tactical nuclear weapons, and it's going to stimulate the administration to want to strengthen our tactical nuclear weapons quite a lot. So I think that's going to be an important side effect of this of this war.
Let's take one more here and then we'll go to one from the Zoom.
Yeah, so my question is about the cyber dimension of what we've seen in Ukraine so far. And from what I've seen, we really haven't seen a lot. So I was wondering what your folks read on that is, especially given Putin's kind of total commitment that we talked about earlier in the session. Why haven't we seen sort of the 2020 equally cyber kinetic warfare that I think we all kind of predicted?
Yeah, repeat the question there. And
Absolutely. I think that the question, to summarize succinctly, is why we haven't seen more cyber activity in this conflict than we expected.
If I could jump in, I think, and this is not based on any inside information, I think Putin is deterred because he feels that major cyber attacks will produce reciprocity and he might not fare well in the total exchange. By the way, I wanted to mention something else. It's not on cyber, but as long as I have the floor for a second. I had the opportunity when I was in the Obama administration to chair something called the High Level Group, the NATO High Level Group, which is the group that oversees nuclear weapons policy for the alliance. So this was in front of all the members of NATO. And I was really moved and struck during coffee breaks when, and this is, it's only because I held the position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs that I was in that position. It was always going to be an American chair of the High Level Group. It's always been that way. And in the coffee breaks, a number of representatives from Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic came up to me unsolicited and said, we want to thank you, not Michael, but to thank the United States for admitting us to NATO, because if we didn't get admitted to NATO, we'd be speaking Russian today. And you also saw, by the way, the president, I think, of Lithuania just spoke 2 days ago to an American group and said, Putin will not stop with Ukraine. The Baltics are next. And he wants much more military support now to deter that.
we take one from the web here, and then we'll come back to you right after. And this is a really good question from Aaron Novak. I think, following on what we've all been through, particularly the younger generation of the pandemic, which has been so disorienting and so stressful. And the question is, I want to acknowledge that the stress of recent events are new for the current generation of younger Americans, especially for people involved in nuclear issues. How do you approach managing the anxiety of considering possible nuclear threats? Any advice from living through the nuclear threats of the Cold War? I think I remember it vividly. I don't know what we did. There's no place, you can't run. Over to you.
I'm too young to remember the Cold War.
So I'm also too young to really remember living through the Cold War, or at least I wasn't super conscious when I was alive during the Cold War. But I think that I can offer at least one idea about managing the anxiety. So I think that the events that we've seen recently have really showcased why it is so important to work in nuclear security and non-proliferation research and development. And so there are efforts available for students as well. I mean, at the undergraduate as well as graduate level, things like the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium here at UC Berkeley that is in place to train the next generation of nuclear security experts. And so as long as we're continuing to rely upon deterrence, which is imperfect, we have to continue to work to reduce the risks. And this is way in which you can get involved and work with national laboratory scientists to help develop technologies to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to prevent or detect unauthorized access to nuclear materials. And so this conflict really highlights the importance of those efforts, and working to make a difference is an option, even for our students.
Can I just want to amplify, the point that Bethany has made. I think this is incredibly important, right? This for young people ought to be a sort of call to arms to take seriously nuclear weapons as a security threat, as an existential security threat, for human civilization. Right, prior to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, nuclear risks commanded very little attention on this campus by comparison with risks emanating from anthropogenic climate change. Mm-hmm. And yet, these weapons endure as the most awesome, devices of mass destruction that humanity has ever invented. And I think for far too long, we've sort of persevered in the blithe assumption that deterrence is both stable and effective. And what we're learning today is that it may be neither. And that's a terrifying proposition. And it should cause us, to more than redouble, to increase by many orders of magnitude our engagement with nuclear weapons as an urgent, perhaps the most urgent security threat that we confront, which is exactly what, people who lived through the Cold War, like the late George Shultz, mm-hmm. and, Bill Perry have been, clamoring, for us to do, but we haven't listened. Now I think, well, of course, the nuclear engineers have listened, but the rest of us haven't listened, and now we should.
Thank you. It's great advertisement for Bethany there. So join the nuclear policy working group. Yeah. We have a question here in the audience.
Yeah, so I'm curious about how we should be interpreting some of the misinformation and disinformation that's coming out of the Russian side, knowing their potential for false flag operations. So I'm wondering, in the media, they've been claiming that Ukraine has been developing nuclear weapons, has been attempting to develop nuclear and chemical weapons. And so I'm wondering if we should be interpreting that as a potential of setting the stage for a tactical nuclear explosion that then could be blamed on Ukraine, as possibly as raising domestic support for mass mobilization of Russians. Or is it merely something that's put out there as an excuse to kind of lower dissent among the domestic population?
So let me repeat that, and that's an excellent question. It has to do with the whole campaign of misinformation going on, particularly of which there's so many brands and so many allegations. I think, just as an editorial comment, I can't speak for the man in the street in Russia, what they're likely to believe from everything they're presented with on Russian television. But particularly the claim that as a pretext for the war, that the Ukraine had been developing weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and so forth, and whether that is an explicit signal that they may be using a nuclear weapon there. I've had extensive conversations with Jake Hekla, who has provided us with an immense amount of information in preparation for this panel, one of our graduate students who's an open source analyst and has been in Chernobyl many times for research and is actually getting updates from his colleagues there and so forth. My understanding is that Putin, having formerly, his former role as the head of the KGB, has been very skillfully for about 20 years, since the early 2000s, in a very skillful way, has actually been allowing the simulacra of a free press and journalists, handsome talking heads on the press, who are allowed to opine and on this and that, not say anything explicitly that would get them jailed, but people who don't understand where the side their bread is buttered on would not get promoted in the journalistic field. And over a period of years, he simply narrowed the boundaries inside of where people are, the journalists, various differing voices in the Russian press, journalists are allowed to speak, but everyone within those guardrails are giving something which is acceptable to the regime. So it really comes off as something very plausible, what they're hearing every day on television. Nevertheless, the preposterous the preposterous assembly of things that have been said recently, I think one really has to wonder whether the average Russian at some point would cease finding these things believable. But whether or not the specific allegations about weapons of mass destruction are really a signal for the potential use of a nuclear weapon, I'm going to turn that over to the panel.
You know, it's one of a dozen different big lies that have accompanied Moscow's invasion. So in that respect, even though I don't believe that his aspirations go beyond Ukraine unless provoked, but in that respect, it's Hitlerian in its propaganda strategy. The big lie. There are so many of them that you know, it's sort of the mentality of a wartime mobilization. And while there is a stratum of professionals and intelligentsia who do not believe it, and those are the ones that are getting arrested by the thousands on the streets of Russian cities, I think the bulk of the population has a hard time imagining in a wartime context that what they're being told is the opposite of the truth. Another example of this is calling the Ukrainian leadership Nazis when their president is a Jew who lost family in the Holocaust. But these kinds of tropes resonate with a broad enough spectrum of the Russian population that they don't want to suspend disbelief.
Yeah, my view is that Putin's big lies are aimed primarily at the Russian domestic audience to ensure that he's able to control the opposition to his regime. He's very concerned about his own survivability. I pray he's not doing it to get ready to use a weapon of mass destruction in Ukraine. But I think that that's less likely. I saw on TV, some of you may have seen it, there were 3 Russian police officers who were involved in the military fighting, and they were captured by the Ukrainians, and they went on television. I don't know if any of you saw this. And one of them in particular was speaking, and he said that they knew absolutely nothing. These are police officers who went into Ukraine as part of Russian military invasion. They knew absolutely nothing about the whole Ukrainian situation until they literally crossed into Ukrainian territory. And Putin's popularity, I understand, I saw some reports saying it's quite high. It's 70 or 80%. And they interviewed some women who have been in touch with their own sisters who are in Ukraine, who say, we can't believe a thing that my Ukrainian sister says. The Russian president has told us why they're in Ukraine, and that's good enough for us. So I think he has, his big lie is working, his very broad support, and as long as it stays that way. Now, maybe when the body bags start coming back in larger numbers, and this goes on for a long time, and if the economy really goes south, then that'll change. But initially, I think he's doing very well in terms of sustaining domestic support.
Thanks. Actually, a related question on the domestic situation of Russia. So he's doing a very good job of suppressing dissent in terms of ideology, but I understand that the populace, got used to their Starbucks and their IKEA. And at what point do they start to become discontented to the point that he shifts his strategy, perhaps?
Yeah, a very astute comment, and that is that the Russian populace has, as our questioners as has gotten used to their Starbucks and IKEA, and at what point will the pinch, in fact, severe pinch, begin to change, the pendulum, or as I think one editorial I read recently, was sort of headlined, the Russians have built up an amazing economy in 3 decades, and it's been wiped out literally in 1 week with this ill-advised war, and it won't come back quickly. But I think Professor Nacht has sort of intimated that, and that is that with time, the pendulum would certainly change, would certainly swing. When the I haven't followed the ruble today, but it's been in bad shape. There is a final question we should ask. We've got about 3 minutes here. It goes in a very different direction. Justin and we thought we had enough things to worry about. Eddie Kenyon has asked a question here. It says, perhaps this question is too tangential for the specific panel. Does this conflict encourage or discourage China's desire to take back Taiwan? We just get out of the pandemic and now we get to Ukraine. And before we're finished with Ukraine, we're now talking about China again. So anyway, let me turn this over first to, we'll let George go first and Mike will go second and the rest of the panel.
I don't know how China is processing this, but I would speculate that if tactical nuclear weapons got used in this conflict, it could be processed in Beijing as crossing threshold, a taboo threshold that could be used by the United States to justify the use of tactical nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan. Pure speculation.
I think that China is really puzzling over this. This is a big deal for Xi Jinping. He's made a great effort to cozy up to Putin. They have intelligence and military ties that they haven't had going back to the pre-Nixon visit. It puts the US in a box to potentially be fighting a 2-front war against 2 major nuclear powers, Russia and China. But he's cautious, and the Chinese are careful about what they're doing. I mean, we can get into the whole Chinese situation. We have a name for what they're doing. It's called anti-access area denial capabilities to keep US naval and air forces from projecting into the Western Pacific in the event of a crisis in Taiwan. Now, Xi Jinping has talked about taking Taiwan back in a way that most Chinese leaders haven't done since Nixon's visit in '72. So I don't know, but I'm hopeful that they'll be more cautious and prudent and not side with Putin or do anything that would lead to US involvement against China.
I'll just add that I also don't know, but I think that the US security commitments to Ukraine are obviously very different than to Taiwan. And so I'm not sure how much you can reason from the current scenario, as China in terms of decision making in that case.
I might just add one reflection, and I want to try to strike a somewhat hortatory note, in this very difficult situation that we're grappling with today. I think prior to the Soviet invasion, it was sort of intuitive for many pundits and commentators in the United States and the Western world more broadly to assume that Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian people, were going to collapse very quickly in the face of an awesome, military offensive by one of the world's largest and most effective, conventional military forces. I think there was a tendency to assume, the basic, capability of a coercive, sort of authoritarian state. To get its way at the expense of a decadent, not supremely effective democracy. I think what we see in Ukraine's resistance is a very different picture of the world. I think we see sort of the vigor and the determination of a free people fighting to preserve their freedom. And I think that that's a spectacle that should give China serious misgivings about the facility with which an amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Straits could be executed, about the facility with which a long-term military occupation of Taiwan could be sustained. Right, there are striking parallels, I think, between the trajectories of national development that the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians have followed. Taiwan becomes a democracy, Ukraine becomes an independent post-Soviet republic. In the intervening 30 years, the Taiwanese have built a nation. They've built a democracy, a flourishing, exemplary democracy. And I think that what we see in Ukraine's sort of valiant resistance is the military effectiveness of the citizenry, under arms, and that should give Beijing misgivings, much as I hope that it is today giving Moscow regrets.
With that, I would like to thank our panelists, Professor Breslauer, Professor Nacht, Dr. Goldblum, and Professor Sargent here. It's been and I'd like to thank our audience, both in person and in Zoom, for contributing to this very stimulating discussion. And I'd like to thank again the IIS here who have supported this, and Linda and Claudia, and also the Goldman School for co-hosting this as well. So with that, I'm going to draw this panel to conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you very much.